People often talk about boundaries like they're an act of strength, like something you decide on once you've grown old enough to stop caring about conflict. But most boundaries don't begin that way at all. They usually start with fatigue, with the slow recognition that something you've been allowing has been draining you over time. Boundaries aren't born from confrontation. They can be, but most are born from noticing how much access someone has to you, how much access they have to your emotions, your time, and your sense of responsibility, how that access expands quietly until it starts to feel less like connection and more like obligation. A lot of conflict in relationships doesn't come from cruelty. It comes from entitlement that was never questioned. People grow accustomed to leaning on someone who is reliable, compliant, and emotionally available. Not noticing the weight of that dependency, they don't ask whether or not the support is freely given or quietly endured. They just assume it will remain because it's been that way. This dynamic shows up after breakups, inside families, between parents and their children, anywhere someone once held a role that made them useful. When the tension begins is when that access is reduced or revoked. When access is removed, the reaction is rarely neutral. Confusion turns into anger, accusations of selfishness surface, and history starts getting rewritten. Because to the person losing access, the boundary, it feels like rejection. But to the person setting it, the boundary usually doesn't feel dramatic. It feels like survival. It feels like finally admitting that continuing as things were would mean losing what little peace they have that remains. There's a pattern underneath this that repeats itself quietly. One person takes on far more responsibility than is reasonable, not because they're asked directly, but because they're assumed to be more capable and dependable. They're easier to lean on than to establish roles. They become the emotional buffer, the one who absorbs impact so others don't have to. Over time, that arrangement stops feeling temporary and starts feeling normal. Comfort settles in, expectations form, and entitlement begins to appear. The problem is that entitlement doesn't dissolve just because circumstances change. It doesn't resolve just because you've had a confrontation. A relationship can end, a child can grow up, a role can disappear, but the expectation often still lingers. Insisting on the same level of access, even when the context that created it no longer exists. You see this clearly when someone wants freedom from a relationship, but not freedom from its benefits. They grow accustomed to a safety net, and when that net is removed, the response is emotional rather than reflective. This becomes even more complicated in families where love is often treated as something that should override discomfort, where patience is expected to be infinite and effort unconditional. Eventually, questions start to form. The questions shift from what's the right thing to do and towards what is this costing me? That's usually where boundaries appear, a line drawn to preserve oneself. Now, from the outside, these decisions are easy to judge. People say things like, that's still your family or that's still your responsibility, but those judgments usually come from people who haven't lived inside the vortex that is unrestricted access. They haven't felt the years of small concessions adding up, the constant recalculating, or the slow erosion of emotional safety. Boundaries aren't set after one incident. They're set after patterns repeat themselves enough times, and you're no longer willing to negotiate peace. So many times that hope feels like an afterthought. It's easy to mistake compliance for peace, to believe that minimizing yourself is the price of keeping things calm. That availability without limits is what love looks like. But nothing improves under those conditions. The pattern doesn't change, it just resets. And when you finally step back, what's surprising isn't the distance, it's the reaction. Boundaries are rarely met with understanding by people who benefited from your flexibility. You setting boundaries feels like betrayal to someone who thrived off of your silence. This is where boundaries get labeled as aggression. They cannot accept the change, so they mislabel them. They twist your words so you feel ashamed for setting boundaries. The reality is, boundaries exist to stop harm from repeating, to keep resentment from building up, and to end cycles that have already shown they won't correct themselves. Not every relationship deserves unlimited access, and endurance without boundaries doesn't lead to loyalty, it leads to burnout. When you stop giving unrestricted access, life doesn't suddenly become peaceful or easy, but it does become clearer. Your time starts to feel like your own again. Your energy isn't constantly spent on managing reactions or anticipating demands. Conversations feel lighter because they're no longer loaded with obligation. You notice that you can show up without bracing yourself. You notice that silence isn't automatically something you owe, and that being unavailable no longer makes you feel ashamed or like a failure. Over time, boundaries don't shrink your world, they give it shape. They teach you that connection is something you participate in, not something that consumes you, and that preserving yourself isn't abandonment. It's how you make room for relationships that will actually respect your boundaries.
If you enjoyed this video, if you could support me by going to the link in the video description if you're on a laptop or PC, and going to the channel description if you're on a mobile phone to share or donate to my family's GoFundMe, it would mean a lot. Thank you so much.